Uranium, one of the most hated commodity on Earth. Today, it is about to become the most fought over resource on the planet. For decades, Western power sold off the most critical piece of nuclear supply chain, the capacity to enrich uranium ore. Today, Russia currently commands approximately 40 to 46% of the entire world's uranium enrichment capacity. This operational dominance creates a structured choke point that leaves the majority of the global markets, including that of the United States of America and the United European Union, vulnerable to the price volatility and political leverage. So, how did we get here in the first place? After 2011 Fukushima disaster, nations began pushing out their reactors due to safety concern and public anxiety over radioactive leaks. Germany permanently shuttered its last 3 reactors in 2023, leading to collapse in the sector investment, and the industry assumed nuclear power was completely dead. Then enters artificial intelligence and its insatiable hunger for non-stop baseload power. Microsoft is paying to restart 3 Mile Island, the site of the America's worst nuclear accident, to power AI data centers. On the other side of the Pacific, China is operating 60 reactors and is currently building more than 150 reactors, and they are to be completed by 2030. As a result, the global demand for the uranium is projected to be more than double by 2040, while a large portion of the existing uranium supply is expected to deplete by 2030 or 2035. And the critical choke point feeding that demand sits inside a supply chain controlled by a handful of nations, with ultimate bottleneck located right inside Moscow. So, in this video, I will prove you 3 things. First, the fight was never about uranium ore. It was about enrichment, and I will show you why through the lens of Iran. Number 2, the supply crunch is locked by physics itself and lead time that money cannot shortcut. Number 3, exactly where this becomes investable, split across layer 0, the fuel, and layer number 5, the power, which is the main bottleneck of the age of AI. If you saw my framework video, I break the entire AI economy into 10 layers, and the deeper you go, the more physical and powerful each layer becomes. So, if you haven't watched it, it's on top left right here. It is essential to watch it to understand this. Today, we go all the way down to the bottom. Layer number 0, the raw material, everything else is built on. This is the first video of my 10 AI infrastructure series. That's why it's important to watch. We are starting at the foundation. My name is Rahil Malik, and you are watching the investment thesis. None of this is a financial advice, but before we go further into the analysis, let's define what uranium is. Uranium is older than Earth, forged in exploding stars billions of years ago and slowly decaying ever since, which is exactly what makes it useful. It is dense, silvery metal, about as heavy as gold, but far more reactive. Here is the key fact that drives the whole industry. Natural uranium comes in 2 forms. U-235, the part that actually spits and releases energy, the good stuff, and 238, which is almost useless for power. The problem is that U-235 makes up to only 0.7% of the natural uranium. The other 99.3% is the useless kind. So, before uranium can power anything, you have to concentrate the good part. A normal reactor needs uranium enriched to between 3 to 5%. U-235 up from a natural 0.7%. Anything below 20% is a reactor fuel. Anything above 20%, especially around 90%, that is the weapon grade territory. And that's basically the whole reason enrichment is such a big geopolitical issue. The exact same technology that can make fuel for power plants can also, if you keep pushing it further, produce materials for nuclear weapons. And once a country has already reached 60% of enrichment, the remaining climb to roughly 90%, which is the weapon grade material, can be measured in weeks rather than years, because most of the technical work has already been done. Enrichment in itself is a very hard process. You're separating 2 things that are chemically identical using only tiny differences in their weight, with thousands of centrifuges spinning at a supersonic speed. To put it in scales, it takes 10 kilograms of natural uranium to produce just 1 kilogram of reactor fuel. The other 9 comes out as depleted waste. 10 times more raw material than finished fuel every step concentrating that tiny silver U-235, building that enrichment capacity takes decades and billions of dollars. But once you have it, you control who gets the reactor fuel and who does not. It is the ultimate choke point, which is exactly why Russia controlling the 40% of the world enrichment matters so much. Next is the fuel cycle, bottleneck by bottleneck. Getting uranium from underground rock to the reactor is one of the most complex industrial process on Earth. And every single step is its own choke point. It starts with mining, although mining is not always the right word. More than half of the world's uraniums now comes from a process called in situ leaching. Instead of digging giant pits or tunnels, the companies drill wells into deposits, dissolve the uranium underground, and pump the uranium rich solution back to the surface. Somewhat similar to that of fracking. But here, think of it as like a French press coffee machine. You run the water through the ground, collect the coffee that comes out. Here, the uranium stays under the ground and you push the fluid through the deposits and bring the dissolved uranium back up while leaving most of the rock where it is. It's cheaper, faster, and climate sustainable, and one of the reasons Kazakhstan is becoming the world's largest uranium producer. What comes back up get processed into a yellow cake, a coarse uranium oxide powder. It takes a whole ton of ore to get just a few kilograms of it. Then comes conversion. The yellow cake is turned into a uranium hexafluoride, or UF6. Because centrifuges can only enrich a gas, it cannot put solid uranium into the machine. It has to become a gas first. That makes conversion one of the least talked about choke points in the entire fuel cycle. There are only 5 major conversion plants in the world, located only in 5 countries: the United States, Canada, France, Russia, and China. If just one of them goes offline, the entire industry feels the pinch. Then enrichment itself. Historically, enrichment was done with gaseous diffusion, the same basic method used during Manhattan process. That process pushed uranium gas through barrier after barrier because the lighter U-235 just a notch faster than the heavier 238. Each pass barely budged the concentration, so it took hundreds of stages and staggering amount of electricity. The modern enrichment is a whole different story. Today, the world uses centrifuges, a tall machine spinning uranium hexafluoride gas at an extreme speed, where the heavier U-238 moves towards outside and the lighter 235 is drawn closer to the center. Every stage creates 2 steams, a small enriched steam that becomes more useful reactor fuel and a much larger depleted stream left behind. Most of the effort goes into the first push from 0.7 to about 4%. Going from there up to a weapon grade takes comparatively little, which is the exact reason civilian enrichment programs makes the world so nervous. That is why enrichment is not just another processing step, it is a high precision industrial capacity. It is a geopolitical choke point. Now, whoever controls that hold the switch for everybody else reactor. Finally, the enriched uranium is pressed into a ceramics pellet and stacked into the fuel rods. Each pellet is the size of a fingertip and holds as much energy as a ton of gold. Yikes. The whole journey from mine to reactor takes 12 to 18 months, with conversion and enrichment concentrated in just few countries. The Western nuclear ambition sits on the most fragile supply to date. Now comes to the question of Iran. Now let me give you my own read on this one. So I want to be clear, this is a hypothesis-led approach, not a fact. So think it through with me rather than taking my word for it, and take my words for what it's worth. You can see why enrichment is a real price, not the ore. By looking at Iran before 2025 strike, Iran has built up over 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, which is not exactly the reactor fuel territory. Reactor fuels are around 3 to 5%. 60% is short technical step away from weapon grade, and getting from neutral uranium to 60% is something like 99% of the total work. The last stretch to 90 is almost trivial by comparison. The fight was never about uranium ore but enrichment itself, which is the real leverage. The countries that can enrich are the one that holds the real leverage, because the same centrifuges that spin the uranium up to the reactor grade can just keep spinning and take all the way to a bomb grade. And it works in reverse too. The same 60% material can be blended down into a reactor fuel fairly easy. Because the harder direction is always the way up, not the other way around. The Americans and the Russians did exactly that for 20 years, turning all Soviet warheads into an American power plant fuel in a deal known as megatons to megawatts. Maybe the strikes were just about stopping the bomb, but America has a long history of covert operation and dubious justification. In a world so short on enrichment, where the West sold off its own capacity and Russia controls nearly 40% of the planet's, who controls the enriched materials matter a lot more today than ever before. So I'm not saying the war was just a whole heist for uranium. Of course, there's oil in the picture and there's Strait of Hormuz and thousands of other issues. But I genuinely think this is one of the angle worth considering, given that it is the United States of America. From an investment point of view, you have to understand one thing and one thing only. The fight here is not about the rock in the ground. What matters is the enrichment and its capacity. So if you could get hold of so much enriched materials, why wouldn't you? That is exactly the choke point we should be watching moving forward. So at the heart of all this is supply and demand equation. And the mismatch is absolutely staggering. On the supply side, you have Kazakhstan alone produces around 40% of the global uranium, more than the next three countries combined. Canada, on the other hand, is second, with the highest grade deposits on Earth in the Athabascan Basin. Namibia is third, and those three countries roughly control 70% of the global production. Australia sits on the large reserves in the world, but barely mines them, blocked by political and land rights. Niger's have some reserves too, but a 20-3 coup threw its production into chaos. On the demand side, the disconnect is even sharper. United States runs the largest reactor fleets in the whole world, around 90 plus reactors needing 18,000 tons of uranium a year. And yet, American mines barely produces 100 tons. The US imports almost all of its uranium. France gets 70% of its electricity from nuclear and produces zero uranium domestically, historically leaning on its former African colonies, just as French influence there collapses. And Russia moves in. Japan and South Korea are restarting and expanding their reactors, which are completely import dependent. So you get this strange map where uranium is located where the reactors are not. The West in general depends on Russia for meaningful slice of both its uranium and its enrichment. Japan buys from a country it has no leverage on, and China, by contrast, has quietly solved its own problem by buying the mines themselves and taking equity stakes across Africa and Central Asia. Notice the pattern, because you will see it again in rare earth and across the whole resource layer. China secures the resources at the source, while in the West we argue about the price, and that's mainly due to the financialization of the economy. The geology does not care about your politics. The uranium is where it is, and increasingly that is not where the demand is. Let's talk about corporate control now. When uranium supply is no longer reliably available, energy security becomes dependent on the countries and the companies that control it. This is particularly important because uranium production is highly concentrated among a limited number of major players. At the center of this market is Kazatomprom, Kazakhstan's state-backed uranium producer. It is the largest uranium producer in the world and one of the lowest cost operators in the industry. In many ways, Kazatomprom plays a role in uranium similar to the Saudi Aramco role in oil. Its production decision matters when Kazatomprom reduces output, supply tightens, and the market responds. When it increases production, the market adjusts accordingly. This reflects the strategic importance of controlling the first stage of nuclear fuel supply chain. Then comes Cameco. Cameco is the Canadian giant and the most important for the Western investor because it is the largest publicly traded uranium company in the world. It owns the richest deposit in Athabascan Basin with a ore grade vastly higher than the global average. And it has diversified. In 2023, it teamed up with Brookfield to buy Westinghouse, one of the biggest nuclear technology companies on Earth. So Cameco is now a bet on the whole nuclear build out, not just the raw material, not just the dirt. Then comes France Orano, the only Western company that can take uranium all the way from ground to finished fuel mining, conversion, enrichment, fabrication. That vertical integration is its strength and weakness. Because if one link breaks, the whole chain suffers, and China runs its nuclear ecosystem through two state owned giants: China National Nuclear Corporation, CNNC, which handles the core fuel and weapon side, while China General Nuclear, or CGN, the country's largest reactor operator, which has been buying foreign uranium asset across Africa and Central Asia. So here is how concentrated this market is. The top 10 producers control around 85% of the supply. On the enrichment side, it is even worse. Four entities: Russia, Rosatom, Europe's Urano, France, Orano, and China, CNNC, controls essentially the entire world, around 99%. That kind of oligopoly means the prices can stay disconnected from reality. When display moves, the moves are usually violent. When they sit still, the market can stay frozen no matter what the demand side is. Then comes the supply crunch. Even the oligopoly cannot conjure uranium from nothing. And that is the real story. Physics is about to bite, and the important point is the world is not literally running out of uranium atoms. There is plenty of uranium in ore in the ground. The shortage is the production capacity, mines conversion, plants, enrichment capacity, and fuel fabrication. A resource can exist geologically and still be unavailable economically, politically, or industrially when the market needs it. That's the thing. The difference between uranium in the ground and the fuel in the reactor. So, global demand is set to climb roughly from 67,000 tons today towards 87,000 by 2030, and over 150,000 tons by 2040, and the mines supplying today start running out empty by 2030. By 2030, the world loses around 20% of the current production capacity, and by 2035, closer to 40%. The real killer is lead time. Uranium isn't like oil, where you just drill and pump. Getting a new mine from first discovery all the way to actual production takes 10 to 20 years, because you have got the exploration, then the feasibility studies, then the environmental permitting. And only then do you actually start building. Take Cigar Lake in Canada. Discovered in 1981, flooded catastrophically in 2006, and it did not begin real production until 2014. 33 years from the paper to product, and they had to freeze the ground into the wall of ice to hold back the water. This is crucial point. This is not a problem you can solve by throwing unlimited money at it. Even if uranium double in price tomorrow, you cannot meaningful add supply for a decade. The projects needed for 2035 should have been under construction, and not, because the exploration that should have happened back in 2010 never did happen. Since the prices were in the gutter after the Fukushima, an entire investment cycle got skipped, and you cannot get those years back. Notice where the price is already today. Uranium went from $35 in 2020, that's roughly $77 a kilo, to $88 a pound by 2026, around $175 a kilo. The market has started to waken up, and the question is whether it is waking up to how structural this shortage really is. How the West sold its nuclear future, and this brings us to the part that is really a geopolitical story. Today, Russia's Rosatom control about 40% of the world enrichment, and China is catching up fast. So how did America, the country basically invented this whole industry, end up so exposed? For this, you have to go back to the 1990s, when the Soviet Union had just collapsed, and the mood in Washington was the history has ended and America won permanently. In that confidence, or arrogant, dare I say, the United States made two fatal moves. Number one, the deal was called megatons to megawatts. From 1993 to 2013, the United States bought down blended uranium from dismantled Soviet Union warhead and turned it into a reactor fuel. Around 500 tons of weapon-grade materials, the equivalent of roughly 20,000 warheads. At the peak, it supported nearly half of all the US commercial reactor fuel, which means for years, about 10% of America's electricity was literally coming from old Soviet bombs. Second, it privatized its own government's enrichment infrastructure, reasoning that in a peaceful, unipolar world, there was no point of spending billions of dollars to maintain expensive public nuclear capacity when you could have just simply imported it cheaply. So back in 1992, America took its government enrichment operations and turned it into a company called USEC, the United States Enrichment Corporation. Then in 1998, under the Clinton administration, the government sold it off to a private investor, pocketing about $3 billion and walking away from the business entirely. And then the private owners did exactly what you would expect them to do when cheap Russian fuel already flowing in and America's own old plants were expensive to run. They made the easy short term call. Why spend billions upgrading when you can just import it instead? So, executive took a fortune. The shareholders took the dividends, and the country's enrichment capacity was quietly run into the ground. When the uranium prices collapsed after the Fukushima in 2011, the company couldn't survive it. It went bankrupt in 2014, and the last American enrichment plant had already shut its door. America went from controlling something like 40 to 50% of the world's enrichment in 1980s to almost nothing. China, on the other side, did the complete opposite. Through the state-owned enterprises with no quarterly earning to answer, it built enrichment from nothing to a major share in 2 decades. Steady investment in energy sovereignty. As a result, America is now spending billions trying to rebuild what it sold. And it banned Russian uranium imports in May 2024, but with the waiver running to 2028 because there was nowhere else to get the enrichment. And something tells me that the war will end soon and this waiver will be extended. There is no other clear option in the short term. New capacity takes 10 to 15 years to build, and the centrifuge technology is so sensitive that even allies do not share it. And there is a trap inside a trap. Many of the next-gen reactors need a higher enriched fuel called HALEU, which stands for highly ashy, low enriched uranium. And almost no one in the West makes it yet. Advanced reactors need fuel before anyone will fund them. But no one will spend billions expanding enrichment until they are sure those reactors will actually get to build. That's a fair argument. Each side is waiting for the other, and that extends the deadlock. That deadlock is exactly why the bottleneck doesn't clear on its own. It needs someone, usually the government, to step in and break the standoff. Europe is in the same trap, isn't doing any better. It sanctioned Russian gas and paid the price in spikes, but it cannot quit the nuclear fuel. Simple reason, because Eastern European countries run Soviet-designed reactors that physically only accept Russian fuel assemblies. At the time of recording, there is no Western substitute that fits. The older order assumed a few trusted suppliers would serve everyone. Instead, we have a world in which nobody trusts each other's supply chain any longer, particularly after the COVID. And one more thing is changing. That is the regulation. For decades, nuclear has been held back not only by fuel supply, but by an extremely conservative radiation framework built around the linear no threshold model and ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. In simple terms, the system treats even tiny radiation exposure as something to push as close to zero as possible, even when the real world risk was extremely low. Now, the United States is starting to reconsider that. In 2025, the government directed the Nuclear Regulation Commission to re-examine its reliance on linear no threshold, LNT, and ALARA, adopt more scientific-based radiation limits, and move forward faster, licensing for new reactors. That does not solve the uranium shortage tomorrow. It certainly does not create enrichment capacity magically, but it tells you something important. Nuclear is finally treated as a strategic infrastructure once again. So, the bottleneck is moving on 2 fronts at once. At layer 0, the world needs more uranium conversion and enrichment. At layer 5, it needs faster reactors, faster licensing, and a grid that can actually absorb nuclear build-out. This brings me to the 7-layer resource map. So, before we get to names, Let me show you the lens I use on every raw material in this series. I don't want to hand you a fish, I want to teach you how to fish, right? So, because uranium is just number one, you already know the big framework, 10 layers AI infrastructure, link in the top right, where uranium sits at layer number 0 as the fuel and nuclear power sits at layer number 5, feeding the grid. But every resource at layer 0 breaks down the same 7 ways. And this is the lens I use to take any raw material apart, the anatomy beneath the big framework. Layer number 1, the raw input. What does the industry physical need? For us, that's uranium. Layer number 2, the processing choke point that turns that raw input into something usually usable. That's conversion and enrichment. We have already seen that's where the real power sits, right? So then comes the third layer of this framework, the picks and shovel. Who builds the tools, the components, and service that everyone else depend on? Then come layer number 4, the operator. Who owns and run productive assets, the mines and the reactors? Layer number 5, the demand layers, who actually needs the output, and layer 6, the speculative frontier, what could reshape the entire chain. The small modular reactor, the next gen design, and then the seventh layer, the one most analysts completely miss. And the one that matters the most is the geopolitical access overlay, who is allowed, trusted, or willing to supply who. Here's why the last layer is everything. A resource can exist, a company can produce it, a country can have the capacity, but if the political relationship breaks, and the supply may as well not exist. And let's treat global supply as if everyone can buy from everyone at the same price. But in strategic industry, that is simply not true. Supply is not global, supply is political. For uranium, it's not about where the uranium is, it's whether the US can actually access it. Whether Kazakhstan leans towards Russia, China, or to the Western side. Whether France can still rely on Africa as its influence there collapses. Whether Eastern Europe can ever replace Russian fuels in the reactor that physically only accept Russian assemblies. Whether allies will share enrichment technology, and who gets the fuel first when the market tightens. That is completely different and much sharper question than is uranium cheaper or expensive. And you will see this exact pattern when we go down to rare earth and semiconductors. The question is never whether the world has the resources. It's who controls the choke points and who is politically allowed to get through it. In a strategic industry, supply is not just a question of geology, capacity, or price. It is the question of access. Who has it, who needs it, and who is politically allowed to get it. And that means the real uranium shortage isn't only physical. The fuel exists somewhere, but in crisis, the only supply that matters is the one your allies are actually willing to give you. Think about how Iran throttled a fifth of the world's oil just by threatening to close Strait of Hormuz. Same logic goes for the uranium access or geology, except here the choke point isn't straight, it's enrichment. China is poised to build about 150 more reactors. That's quite a lot. But would China ever give it to its competitors? That is the whole logic about it. So where the money is, the investable map. Let's talk about that. So let's get to the part that most matter to us, where this is actually investable. Uranium touches 2 layers of my framework at once. It is the fuel at layer 0 and it powers the grid at layer number 5. And power is the main choke point in AI investment. It's all one chain, but each part offers a different kind of exposure and different level of risk. Start with layer 0, the fuel itself. If you want the purest bet on the uranium price with absolutely no mining risk and no management to worry about. Then there is the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, ticker U.U in Toronto. It does one thing. It buys physical uranium. When Sprouts buy aggressively, it pulls physical uranium off the market and tightens the spot price for everybody involved. In this case, the financial layer literally eats the physical supply. If you want the miner, the cleanest Western name is Cameco. Ticker CCJ, the largest publicly traded uranium company in the world. When uranium runs, Cameco runs the hardest. Cameco is more than just a miner now. Back in 2023, it teamed up with Brookfield to buy Westinghouse, one of the closest and biggest names in nuclear. around $80 billion. Cameco took just under half. Brookfield took the rest. Westinghouse isn't a miner, it's the company that actually builds and serves the reactor. Its AP1000 is one of the most widely deployed reactor design in the world, and it makes its money on long-term contracts to fuel and maintain plants for years at a time. So overnight, Cameco went from being a bet on the price of uranium to being a bet on the entire nuclear build-out, the dirt at the bottom and the reactor at the top. In the late 2025, the Westinghouse partnership signed a binding deal with the United States government to build up to 8 large reactors, a program worth at least 80 billion United States dollar with a big fat capital B. And the stated reason was to power data centers and AI. Think about what this tells you. The government is now arranging the financing and clearing the permits, and the thing pulling it all forward is AI demand. This entire thesis, AI reaching all the way down to layer 0, happening in real time. So, with one company sitting right in the middle of it, the lowest cost producers on Earth is Kazatomprom. I butchered the name, I know, which trades in the US over the counter as NATKY. But it carries the geopolitical baggage of sitting in Kazakhstan, right before Russia and China. Then the picks and shovel play. And this is a really good one. BWXT technology, ticker BWXT. It is the only large-scale maker of specialized uranium components and naval reactors in the North of America, and one of the few companies cleared to handle the high ashy enriched uranium that we talked about earlier, that the next generation reactors needs. A huge chunk of its business is building reactors for the United States Navy, which insulate it from the commodity cycle entirely. It does not need the uranium price to cooperate, just the nuclear build-out to continue. Now moving to layer number 5. The power itself. The companies that turn the uranium into electricity for the grid and increasingly for AI data centers, these are the reactor operators I cover in the framework video. Constellation Energy, ticker CEG, the largest nuclear fleet in America, the one that struck a 3-mile island deal with Microsoft and Vistra. Ticker VST uses similar logic with a more diversified fleet. These are not uranium bets, these are electricity bets. They make money selling always on power to the grid that is suddenly desperate for it. And then the two ends of the risk spectrum. On the speculative end, you have Oklo, a pure play on small modular micro reactors backed by big names, but pre-revenue with nothing meaningful coming until 2027 and a valuation that already priced in a lot of dreams and hopes. So high risk, high reward, and the choke point bet. And now the choke point bet. Centrus Energy, ticker LEU, the only US listed pure play on the Western Enrichment. This is where things started to get spicy. And here's the thing, is the same company rose out of the bankruptcy of USEC, the exact company that sold off American Enrichment in the first place. The one that let it go is now the one trying to win it back. It already runs the first plant in America licensed to produce ALEU, that higher enriched fuel the next generation reactor needs. So it's not just a promise, they are the one actually doing something. It lives and dies on the contract, so it can be volatile, but also can be a good thing. But it's the most direct way you can actually buy a bet that the West has to reshore the one part of the chain Russia controls. So history says when America is strategically in trouble, the government comes and step up. That is given that the government maintain its financing healthy and it can really pull its own debt. If you want the metal, you're looking at a Sprott or Cameco. If you want the cycle-proof build-out bet, you are looking at BWX. If you want the power story, that's Constellation or Vistra. If you want to bet on West breaking Russia's chokehold on enrichment, Centrus is the most direct name. If you want the lottery ticket on the next generation of reactors, that's Oklo. That's the 6 different ways into the same chain, from safest owning the metal to the wildest betting on a reactor that really doesn't exist yet. I'm not financial advisor. I'm not paid by any of these companies. So please do your DD, your due diligence. I'm just really trying to teach you is how to think like an investor, how to build an investment mindset. I am not in the business of picking stocks. I am in the business of identifying threats and opportunities moving forward. My job is to look into a decade ahead and see what opportunities can be fit, what technological breakthrough would be essential for our next phase of technological survival or civilization improvement. And everything in this chain comes back to one filter only. Where is the bottleneck and who sits on it? The names that sits on real choke point. The enrichment, the conversion, the high grade ore, the always on power. Those are structurally different from the names that are just along for a ride. The distinction is the whole game. Get that right, and the rest is just detail, minor detail. So this was never a stock pick video. It was just about one layer or another. It's just to see through a different lens. But these are the names that are important. Be my guest and choose your pick. For closing thoughts, here's where we land. The fight was never about the rock in the ground. It was about the enrichment. The one choke point the West handed over, and now has to claw back in the market where physics won't let the supply catch the demand for a decade, no matter how much money you showed up. And that's the setup. Structured demand, capped supply, and control sitting with a tiny number of players in a tiny number of countries, none of them friendly or aligned very closely to the West. That's why the most hated commodity of the last decades is becoming one of the most strategic of the next. The grid needs power, AI needs the grid, nuclear power runs on one thing the world is about to run dangerously short of. Follow the constraints, not the headlines, and they all point to the same direction. This was the first trip all the way down to the layer zero, the foundation. Everything else is built on. There's more down here: rare earth, copper, materials, and above all, water. That's the whole AI economy quietly depend on. And each one get its own video. A full written breakdown with numbers and names is on my Substack, linked below. Subscribe so you don't miss. And please press that ping notification because these are very detailed videos, so I can't really do it every week. I will try my best, obviously, so the YouTube wouldn't show you this information. So please ping that notification to get the next video. I'll be making one on the rare earth sometime soon, which is the oil of the 21st century. But none of this is a financial advice. Do your own work. See you in the next one. I'm out.